Hey everyone, Mr. Philip Campbell here. This is Lecture 7 in my honors course on modern American history, 1865 to 2000, on the age of FDR and World War II. And in this lecture, I wanted to touch on one of the more shameful aspects of United States history, which is the internment of Japanese American citizens during World War II. I remember not finding out about this until I was older, until I was probably a young man, and I never learned about it in high school. And I remember being quite surprised to find out that the United States had done this. It seemed just very surreal that in a war where we were fighting an enemy, Nazi Germany, who were rounding up individuals based on their ethnicity and putting them in concentration camps, that we ourselves would be doing the same thing, arresting Japanese Americans and putting them in concentration camps because we suspected they were disloyal to the United States. Now, I don't mean to suggest there was a moral equivalency between Japanese internment and the Nazi extermination camps. We were not aiming to eliminate or exterminate the Japanese population. Certainly, Auschwitz was very different from what the United States was doing, but still, the principle was the same. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his administration had ordered the summary arrest and detention of an entire class of people based on their race, because they were thought to be a threat to the nation. So how did this unfold? How did it end? What did it look like? Let's talk about this. Immediately after Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the FBI immediately swept out and arrested over 1,200 Japanese American community and religious leaders across the West Coast with no evidence whatsoever. They were simply arrested because of their identity as leaders in the Japanese American communities. So they were confined, their assets were frozen. In Hawaii, Japanese Americans were rounded up and sent to detention centers on the mainland to get them away from Hawaii. So shortly after Pearl Harbor, this was all before FDR did anything. It was just a guttural reaction to the horror of being attacked at Pearl Harbor. On February 19th, 1942, so this is a few months after Pearl Harbor, FDR signed Executive Order 9066 with the intent of preventing foreign espionage on American shores. And what Executive Order 9066 did was established special military zones in California, Washington, and Oregon, within which most Japanese Americans lived in these states. But within these military zones, it authorized the government to compel the mandatory detention of Japanese Americans in internment camps because they were perceived to be a threat to United States national security. Who was affected by this order? The order affected anyone who was even 1/16th Japanese. So this didn't just affect Japanese foreign nationals who were living here or naturalized Japanese. This included people who were born here, Japanese Americans who were born here, spoke English, were Christians. It didn't matter. If you were 1/16th Japanese, you were affected under this executive order. They were relocated first to temporary detention centers. They were given 6 days to pack some belongings and report to reporting centers. Then they were taken to detention facilities. And these were often large areas that were repurposed to be holding centers. They weren't originally for human habitation. Areas like racetracks or fairgrounds or large cattle stalls, places that were just large areas that were hastily converted to hold large numbers of Japanese American citizens as holding facilities. Often the conditions were not very good in here. And this was temporary while the government set up permanent relocation camps. And there were 10 relocation camps. They were located in California, Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and even Arkansas. And these were the final destination of the Japanese Americans who were interred. So they were spread out amongst these camps. And these relocation centers were essentially military barracks. They were set up like military barracks with mess halls and lodging. They also had post office. They had factories and agricultural work where the Japanese prisoners would make or grow things necessary for their survival in the camps. They also received government rations. However, often rations were insufficient. This was simply very low on the United States government's list of priorities. So there were complaints about poor rations. A lot of these, to add insult to injury, a lot of these camps were put on Indian reservations. The Native Americans complained that the government did not have a right to set up internment camps on their reservations, but of course the government overruled them and put them there anyways. So they functioned as little towns, but they were concentration camps. They were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Those who tried to escape would and were could be and were shot and killed. There were instances of people being shot simply for getting too close to the fence. People who tried to escape were shot and killed. There was widespread anger in these camps over the poor living conditions. Sometimes it turned into protests. If the government feared there would be a riot, they were very brutal in putting it down. The military could fire tear gas into the Japanese American crowds to cow them into submission. Needless to say, the constitutionality of these internment camps was challenged. In the case Korematsu versus the United States of America in 1944, the Supreme Court, in one of its more infamous decisions, ruled that yes, it was constitutional for the government to round up an entire class of people and detain them if they thought they were a threat to United States security. And in Korematsu versus USA, the Supreme Court ruled that the need to protect the USA outweighed the civil rights of Japanese. But interestingly enough, that same year, I think even the same session of the Supreme Court, another ruling came down called Ex Parte Endo, which said that even though the government in theory had the right to detain a class of citizens, it did not have the right to detain citizens who were what it called conceitedly loyal. That is, the government had a burden of proof was on the government to establish that a particular Japanese American citizen was a threat. The Endo case determined that a citizen could not be imprisoned if the government could not prove they were disloyal, which in effect would lead to the closure of the camps, because even though in theory Korematsu said yes, the government can detain people based on their class, Endo said, however, you still have to have reasonable cause that each particular person is disloyal. Because there was no evidence that any particular Japanese American was planning espionage, they were all just regular American citizens who happened to be Japanese. In practice, this meant that FDR had to close the camps down, and the Supreme Court let FDR know what their ruling was going to be, and he voluntarily ended the program the day before the court ordered the enforcement of their decree in the Endo case. So in January 1945, the camps began closing, and the last were closed in March of 1946, and the Japanese Americans were permitted to return to their homes and livelihoods. Altogether, the Japanese internment, through its various phases, affected 117,000 citizens. Now, the Korematsu case is one of those very infamous cases in American jurisprudence where legal scholars look at it and marvel at what a bad judgment it was. It stands up there with Dred Scott, the Dred Scott case, or Plessy versus Ferguson, which established segregation. Just these cases where you wonder, how could they possibly have gotten this so wrong? Korematsu would eventually be entirely repudiated, and there was a study done under Ronald Reagan in 1983, a commission that studied the Japanese internments. The survivors, the descendants of the Japanese victims, were wanting the United States to formally apologize and for the internment and repudiate its policy under Korematsu and Executive Order 9066, which the U.S. government did. And each survivor of the Japanese internment was awarded a $20,000 settlement. So it is one of the more shameful aspects of our history, the Japanese internment, but it's something to keep in mind, something that has happened, and that our history definitely is not always rosy, and that sometimes in the name of security we attack those very liberties which we profess to be defending. So Something to keep in mind for sure.